talk, Sedano. That was should hopefully provide a useful jumping off point for what I'm going to say. I want to talk about some of the, what I see as the emerging challenges of measuring poverty mostly and inequality to a lesser extent in the 21st century. And hopefully this will kind of jump off on some of the points which have already been mentioned. We've had a couple of summaries of what's happened in terms of poverty and inequality in Asia this morning. My very quick summary of it is as follows. If we use the $2 a day measure of moderate poverty from the World Bank, poverty in Asia has come down from about 81% down to just under 50%, while inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient across the whole of Asia has risen, and indeed Gini coefficients in 11 of the countries which make up about 80% of Asia's population have also increased. So around 860 million of the 1.3 million extremely poor people in the world, this is using the 1.25 dollar a day extreme poverty line, live in Asia. We all know poverty is multidimensional, so a few of the indicators of that, if you compare the bottom and the top quintiles in 10 out of 15 Asian countries, poor children from the poorest quintile are at least twice as likely to die as children from the richer quintile. They're also much more likely to be underweight, and in terms of access to sanitation, you have something like 800 million people with no access to toilets and about just 505 million living in slums. All these numbers are taken from a recent Asian Development Bank report entitled Confronting Rising Inequality in Asia. So I'd like to talk about some of the issues to do with, first of all, static poverty measurement, then dynamic poverty measurement, and finally inequality. So everyone accepts that poverty is a multidimensional thing, but the big question is, well, how should such multidimensionality be measured? And there have essentially been two approaches to this. The first, which is largely associated with the World Bank, is the so-called dashboards approach, where you concentrate your resources on trying to measure each dimension as well as you can, and then kind of add them up in the form of tables. So it's a bit like looking at all the different dials on the dashboard of a car or something like that. In contrast, as Sedano mentioned, there have been various multidimensional poverty indices which have been developed, most recently the MPI preceded by the HDI, Physical Quality of Human Life Index, etc., etc. And these multidimensional measures have the great advantage that they are able to look at the overlaps between different dimensions of poverty. However, they come under criticism, particularly from people in favour of that dashboard approach, of not having very well defined weights between which you add up these different weights. As we saw in your presentation, the MPI has something like 10 different indicators going into it. And personally, I find it quite difficult to figure out what the contribution of all those different 10 indicators are. When you have 3 or 4, as in, for example, the Human Development Index, you can kind of get some feel for what's driving it. Once you get to a large number of indicators, this becomes very, very difficult. Now, there is an extremely interesting recent paper by Francisco Ferrer and Mary Lugo, which argues for what one might describe as a middle way between these two approaches. And this is to look at the overlaps between different measures of different dimensions of poverty, but without actually trying to add them up. So there are various tools you can use for that, starting quite simply with things like Venn diagrams, going on to stochastic dominance analysis and copular functions, all of which allow you to look at the joint dimensions of poverty, but without having to add those up. And I would regard this as being kind of one of the areas in which further research and further work is needed, because if you can come up with easy, fairly immediate ways of being able to visualize these overlaps, that addresses a lot of what policymakers' concerns are, without then obscuring what's going on by trying to add them all up into a single index. A second area I want to mention in terms of static poverty measurement is to do with urban issues. We all know that now slightly more than half of the world's population lives in urban areas. And it strikes me that most of our methodologies for measuring static poverty draw very much on old paradigms of rural poverty, the sorts of things you were talking about. So, for example, the standard cost of basic needs method for setting poverty lines is really designed for rural populations with high food shares, and then you try and work out the non-food components of that, based on what consistent patterns for non-food expenditures are. Now, there's an interesting recent book by Diana Midland and David Satterthwaite. It's called Urban Poverty in the Global South. And one of the things they say in that is there is very little questioning in all this debate about poverty lines of the validity of basing the non-food allowance on the non-food expenditures of groups of people who are very unlikely to have adequate provision of their non-food needs. In rural areas, perhaps that was okay, because you could argue that people would only be prepared to give up essential food for essential non-food items, if these were really, really important. But when you start looking at the urban dimensions of poverty, where certain things can simply not be purchased, or if they have to be purchased, they come at a very, very high price. The whole basis of trying to set your non-food component of your poverty line based on food consumption patterns seems to me quite questionable. It's also the case that as populations become increasingly urbanized, one has to question whether expenditures are your best welfare metric. When you move into urban areas, incomes become much more important, things become much more monetized, and indeed incomes, in many cases, with the exception of the informal sector, but certainly in the formal sector, incomes are very much easier to measure. So you have to start thinking about what your welfare measure should be. Urban poverty also has a number of important non-monetary dimensions which are not well captured in existing multi-dimensional poverty measures. Now, I know someone is about to say, but water and sanitation are in the MPI. Well, they are in the MPI, at least safe water is, but is it well measured in the MPI? Again, going back to this recent book by Midland and Satterthwaite, they criticize the way in which the MDGs try and operationalize the concept of safe water and sanitation. To what extent can you really regard piped water as being clean water, for example? So there's big measurement issues there. Other issues, things like pollution and transportation costs or crime, all things which are much more important in urban areas, are not well captured in these existing multi-dimensional poverty measures. And finally, in most countries, household surveys have much more difficulty in locating recent migrants to urban areas. This is a particular problem in countries such as China or Vietnam, which have household registration systems, but also very important due to the highly mobile nature of migrant populations in countries with large informal settlements, of which Indonesia would certainly be a good example. Now, moving on to my second area, which is looking at poverty dynamics and vulnerability. And here I'm probably treading on a lot of the discussions which are happening next door. But it strikes me that as more and more countries become middle income, concern about poverty dynamics, movements in and out of poverty, and vulnerability is increasingly replacing concern about extreme poverty. However, there are no universally accepted measures of vulnerability and no universally accepted measures of chronic poverty. People like Foster and Porter and Quinn have proposed measures of chronic poverty. Ligon and Schletter and Chowdhury and others have proposed measures of vulnerability. But these are not yet enshrined in a commonly accepted measure of poverty dynamics, chronic poverty, vulnerability, in the same way that FGT measures are with static poverty. The measurements of poverty dynamics and vulnerability also requires that governments are prepared to invest seriously in panel data. They need to give much more attention to attrition and much more attention to tracking of households as they move, as they split up, as they divide. These are actually not such difficult technical issues, but they are issues which require careful attention and careful funding. On the other hand, measurement error, which is something which pervades all studies of poverty dynamics and vulnerability, this is an area where much more methodological work needs to be done. In my recent book, I've got some flyers here for anyone who's interested. I describe this as probably the single biggest missing element in terms of good studies of poverty dynamics. Unless you have a satisfactory way of addressing measurement error, and there are adjustment methods, it's just there's no agreement on which one is best. But unless you have a satisfactory way of adjusting for measurement error, then you don't know how much of the movements in and out of poverty are a statistical artifact versus how much are genuine movements in and out of poverty. And finally, again, the points I make in the book is that methods for analysing poverty, income and household dynamics are again relatively underdeveloped. Some people use discrete choice methods, some people use continuous variable models. No one has a particularly good handle on what one does in terms of household dynamics and household splits. So this is an area where further work is required. Now I have a couple of final slides. The first is on inequality measurements. It's really on inequality and polarization measurements. Now, if you went back a few years, people would have said that standard inequality measures such as the Gini don't change very much. These days people say they change relatively slowly given the experience of what's happened with the transition economies. However, these slow changes in standard measures of inequality, such as the Gini, such as the Nile, do not seem to reflect popular concerns on what we might describe as a rich-poor gap, certainly what we describe as the rich-poor gap in Vietnam. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. The first is that these standard measures of inequality tend to give most weight to the middle of the income distribution. A second point is that typically these measures are calculated in developing countries using expenditure, and that tends to actually depress both the amount of volatility there is and also the level of inequality. If you think back to the very old studies done by Klaus Deiniger and Lynn Squire when the World Inequality Database was first set up, they said that systematically a Gini coefficient which is calculated using expenditures tends on average to be 0.06 lower than the Gini coefficient calculated by income, with quite a bit of variation behind it. So you can have really quite dramatic changes depending, quite dramatic differences in inequality depending on whether you use income or whether you use an expenditure. For example, in Vietnam, using expenditure as your welfare measure, income, inequality as measured by the Gini has hardly changed, whereas it's gone up by almost 0.1 if you use income. So this is kind of a technical but a non-trivial issue. All of this work is obviously done using household surveys, but household surveys tend to be particularly bad at capturing the incomes of the ultra-rich. They may not capture them, or when they do interview very rich people, they may just systematically misreport, which is another word for lying. And also, many members of the ultra-poor, particularly unregistered households, rural seasonal migrants, that sort of thing, will tend to be missed by these sorts of household surveys. Now, I want to just broaden out the discussion a bit, because coming back to this rising gap between the rich and the poor, something which has occurred to me for some time is that could it be the case that polarization measures actually capture what policymakers, the popular press, mean by inequality better than conventional inequality measures? I think a case can be made for this, particularly when you think about bipolarization measures, distinct from the ones which work, for example, Duclos, Esteban, and Ray. You can have multiple humps when you identify your polarization measure. But if you think of a haves and have-nots, a polarization measure such as developed by Wolfson, or some of the proposals by Zhang and Canber, for example, in terms of taking ratios of the tile, I think that can tell you a lot about how the welfare of the haves and the have-nots are changing, which might link, as I say, much better to popular perceptions than standard inequality measures. It's also important, this is now quite well recognized in the literature, to distinguish between inequality of outcomes versus inequality of opportunity. Most, although not everyone, would say that inequality of opportunity is more important, and there are sort of certain useful indices, the D index, for example, for summarizing what's happening in individual dimensions of inequality of opportunity. And finally, we have to recognize implicit under all of this is that inequality, like poverty, is a multidimensional concept. But so far there is not so much discussion on multidimensional inequality measures. So that may well be something we see in the future. So if I had to come up with some kind of prioritized wish list in terms of research about what would happen, I would start off by saying we need much more recognition, much greater analysis of the independence between the different dimensions of poverty, using some of these simple summary techniques which I've already been talking about. The same sorts of things can also be applied to measures of inequality. It's important to develop better methodologies for measuring urban poverty, for setting urban poverty lines, for capturing very different dimensions of urban poverty. We need better statistics. We always need better statistics, but particularly on things like clean water and sanitation, also sustainable energy. I would suggest that we need to at least think quite seriously about whether it's better to use polarization measures rather than inequality measures. And linked to that, there is also a literature on mobility measures, which I think links to poverty dynamics, and I won't go into right now. And finally, from a methodological perspective, I would argue that there is an urgent need for a cross-country and cross-method study of the impact of measurement error on poverty dynamics. My last slide is simply some of the references I've drawn on in saying all of this. Thank you very much.